The stretch of Route 41 between Fort Wayne and Evansville, Indiana, is as lonely as it gets. I had driven it plenty of times, hauling deliveries back and forth for work, but this particular night felt different. It was late January, and the Midwest winter had settled in like a heavy blanket. The air was bitterly cold, and the icy remnants of last week's storm still lined the road, glinting in the moonlight. I had left Fort Wayne later than planned and didn't hit the road until nearly 11 p.m. The darkness was oppressive, the kind you only get in rural America, where the only light comes from your headlights and the stars overhead. The radio signal was spotty, and after the third station gave way to static, I switched it off, leaving me alone with the hum of the engine and the faint whistle of the wind seeping through the truck's windows. The road stretched out endlessly ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through flat farmland that seemed to go on forever. The snow-covered fields sparkled under the moonlight, but there wasn't another vehicle in sight. It was the kind of solitude that usually didn't bother me. I'd grown accustomed to it on long drives, but that night, it gnawed at me. About an hour into the drive, I saw it, a shape on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a stray dog, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A man, standing motionless at the edge of the road, his figure stark against the snow. I slowed down instinctively, my headlights catching his face for a split second. He was pale, his features sharp and angular, his eyes fixed on something in the distance. He wore no coat, just a thin shirt and pants, utterly inappropriate for the freezing temperatures. But what struck me most was how still he was, not shivering, not moving, just standing there like a statue. I pulled over a few yards ahead and rolled down the passenger window. "Hey," I called out, "do you need help?" He didn't respond. I craned my neck to look back, but he was gone. The spot where he had stood was empty, the snow undisturbed. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather ran down my spine. I waited a moment, scanning the road and the fields beyond, but there was no sign of him. Finally, I shook my head, chalking it up to fatigue and a trick of the light, and continued driving. The road grew even lonelier as the night wore on. The landscape was unchanging, endless fields punctuated by the occasional barn or silo. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows across the snow. My truck's headlights seemed to barely pierce the darkness, and I found myself gripping the wheel tighter than usual. Then, in the distance, I saw something again. Another figure standing in the middle of the road this time, directly in my path. I slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the icy pavement. The truck came to a halt just a few feet from the figure, and my heart pounded as I leaned forward to get a better look. It was the same man. His face was illuminated by the headlights, his pale skin almost glowing in the light. His eyes, dark and unblinking, stared directly at me. He didn't move, didn't flinch, as if the truck bearing down on him had meant nothing. I honked the horn, but he didn't react. Frustrated and unnerved, I rolled down the window. "Hey, get out of the road!" I shouted. The man tilted his head slightly, as if studying me, and then, without warning, he stepped to the side and disappeared into the darkness. Not walked, disappeared. One moment he was there, and the next, he wasn't. I sat there for a long moment, my breath fogging up the cab. My instinct screamed at me to turn around, to take another route, but the thought of navigating icy back roads in the middle of the night wasn't appealing either. With a deep breath, I pressed on, my eyes darting constantly to the mirrors and the road ahead. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now. The silence, once comforting, had turned oppressive, and every shadow along the roadside seemed to shift and move. My heart raced as I imagined that man appearing again, stepping out of the darkness and into the headlights. I don't know how far I'd driven when the truck's engine began to sputter. The gauges flickered and the truck slowed, coasting to a stop on the shoulder. I tried the ignition, but it wouldn't turn over. My heart sank as I realized I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no cell signal and no other cars for miles. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out into the frigid night. The cold was brutal, biting through my jacket and stinging my face. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the frozen ground. I popped the hood and aimed the flashlight at the engine, though I had no idea what I was looking for. That's when I heard it, the sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, coming from the field to my left. I turned toward the sound, the beam of light sweeping across the snow, but there was nothing there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I backed toward the truck, my pulse racing. As I reached the cab, I saw it, the faint outline of a figure standing at the edge of the field just beyond the reach of the flashlight. It was him. The man from the road stood motionless, his dark eyes fixed on me. Slowly, he raised a hand and pointed toward the horizon. I turned, following his gesture, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of fields and the faint glow of the moon. When I looked back, he was gone. I didn't wait to see if he would return. Climbing back into the cab, I locked the doors and wrapped myself in a blanket, praying for daylight. The truck's engine eventually roared to life on its own, as if nothing had been wrong. I didn't question it. I drove through the night without stopping, not daring to look in the mirrors or at the fields beside me. I've taken Route 41 plenty of times since that night, but I'll never forget the frozen silence of that drive, or the figure who seemed to emerge from the shadows. They say the road can play tricks on you when you're alone at night, but some things aren't tricks. Some things are just there. Living in the outskirts of Banff, Alberta, had always been a dream of mine. The rugged beauty of the Canadian Rockies, the crisp mountain air, and the serenity of the wilderness were all I needed to escape the chaos of city life. I'd found the perfect cabin, nestled in a quiet valley with panoramic views of snow-capped peaks and endless pine forests. It was remote, almost too remote, but I loved it. Winter in Banff is no joke though, and I quickly learned to prepare for the worst. The snow came early that year, burying the landscape under thick, heavy drifts. By late January, I'd become used to the silence that accompanied the snowstorms, an almost oppressive stillness that felt like the world had gone to sleep. One night, after a long day of work, I found myself alone in the cabin as the wind howled outside. A storm had rolled in, bringing with it a relentless blizzard that battered the windows and piled snow against the door. The power flickered a few times before going out completely, leaving the cabin illuminated only by the warm, flickering glow of the wood-burning stove. I wasn't worried. I had enough firewood and supplies to last through the storm, and I figured the power would come back in a few hours. I settled onto the couch with a book and a mug of tea, listening to the crackle of the fire and the muffled roar of the wind. But then I heard it, a faint knock at the door. It was so soft that at first I thought I'd imagined it. I froze, my book slipping from my hands. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the snow. Who could possibly be out here in this weather? Grabbing a flashlight, I approached the door cautiously. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the sound of the wind rattling the shutters. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the door and opened it a crack, the freezing air rushing in and making me shiver. No one was there. The porch was empty, the snow piled high and undisturbed, except for a single set of footprints leading up to the door. They were deep and fresh, but they stopped abruptly a few feet away, as if whoever had made them had vanished into thin air. I shone the flashlight across the yard, its beam cutting through the swirling snow. The trees swayed violently in the wind, their branches creaking like old wooden doors. The footprints didn't lead back to the woods or down the driveway. They simply ended. I shut the door quickly, locking it and bolting it for good measure. My heart was racing and I felt a cold sweat forming despite the heat of the stove. I tried to convince myself it was just a traveler seeking shelter or someone lost in the storm, but the way the footprints stopped so suddenly didn't make sense. I returned to the couch, but I couldn't concentrate on my book. Every sound, the groan of the wind, the snap of a branch, made me jump. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. An hour passed. The fire crackled softly, the storm raging on outside. I was just starting to relax when I heard it again. The knock. This time it wasn't at the front door. It was at the back door. My stomach dropped. The back door faced the forest, where the snow was even deeper and the wind harsher. No one in their right mind would approach from that direction, especially not during a blizzard. Grabbing the fire poker, I crept toward the kitchen, my flashlight cutting arcs through the darkened cabin. The knocking came again, soft and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew I was listening. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. "If you need help, say something." The knocking stopped. For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind. Then, faintly, I heard it, a whisper. It was so soft I almost missed it, carried on the wind like a distant echo. I couldn't make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I didn't dare open the door this time. Instead, I backed away, my eyes darting to the windows. The snow was plastered against the glass, obscuring the view, but I thought I saw movement, something tall and shadowy slipping between the trees. The knocking didn't come again, but the whispering continued, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't coming from the door anymore. It was coming from the walls. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like voices, murmuring in a language I didn't recognize. They seemed to move around the cabin, circling me, closing in. Panicking, I threw more logs onto the fire and grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal, not even the faintest bar. The whispering grew louder, almost chanting now, a rhythmic cadence that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, there was a loud thud against the front door, followed by a scraping sound like nails dragging across the wood. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch and shift. I backed into the corner, clutching the fire poker like a lifeline. Then, just as abruptly as it had started, the noise stopped. The whispering, the thudding, the scraping, all of it ceased, leaving an oppressive silence that was almost worse. The storm outside began to calm, the wind dying down to a low moan. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, clutching the poker, jumping at every creak and groan of the cabin. When dawn finally broke, the first light of morning revealed a landscape transformed by the storm, but the footprints were still there, circling the cabin in strange, looping patterns. They didn't lead away from the house. They just stopped. I left that cabin the next day, packing my things and driving back to the city without looking back. Whatever had come to my door that night wasn't human, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what it wanted. Living alone in a small town like Green Hollow, Pennsylvania had its perks. The quiet streets and friendly neighbors made it feel like a place pulled out of a postcard. But Thornhill Road, where I rented a 2-story house, had always been different. It was at the edge of town, bordered by woods that seemed darker and deeper than they should be. People rarely came this way, and the house itself had a reputation, one I didn't learn about until after I'd moved in. It started on an ordinary Tuesday night in November. The chill of winter was creeping in, and a light drizzle pattered against the windows. I had just finished unpacking the last of my boxes and settled onto the couch with a cup of tea. The wind outside howled faintly, making the old house creak and groan. The clock on the mantel struck 10 p.m., and I decided to call it a night. As I turned off the lights, I thought I saw movement outside, a shadow passing quickly across the porch. I froze, my heart pounding. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. "Just the wind," I muttered, shaking my head. I double-checked the locks on the front and back doors before heading upstairs to bed. The bedroom was cozy, with a window that overlooked the woods. As I lay in bed, the sounds of the house seemed louder than usual. The creak of floorboards, the faint whistle of wind through the eaves. I told myself it was just an old house settling. But then I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. I sat up, my breath catching in my throat. It wasn't the wind or the rain. Someone was at the door. Grabbing my phone, I crept downstairs, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The living room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the porch lamp outside. Peering through the peephole, I saw no one. The porch was empty, rain glistening on the wooden boards. Still, my unease didn't fade. I waited for a moment, holding my breath, before heading back upstairs. I had just climbed into bed when the knock came again, louder this time. My stomach turned. Gripping my phone tightly, I called the local sheriff's office. "There's someone knocking on my door," I told the dispatcher, keeping my voice low. "I don't see anyone, but it keeps happening." "Stay inside and keep your doors locked," the dispatcher said. "We'll send a patrol car." Relieved, I sat on the edge of my bed waiting for the sound of sirens, but the house was silent again, as if it were holding its breath. 15 minutes passed, then 30. The knock didn't come again, and when the deputy finally arrived, there was no sign of anyone. "Probably just kids messing around," he said, shining his flashlight around the porch and the edge of the woods. "But I'll do a sweep just to be safe." I thanked him, feeling foolish but still unsettled. After he left, I locked the doors again and tried to sleep, though every creak of the house kept me on edge. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I drifted off. The next morning, I found muddy footprints on the porch. They were faint, as if whoever had been there was trying not to be seen. My heart sank as I realized they didn't lead to the road or the driveway. They led toward the woods. The following nights were worse. The knocking started again, always just after 10 p.m. It came from different parts of the house. First the front door, then the back, and once, disturbingly, from the window of the downstairs kitchen. Each time I looked, there was no one there. I stopped calling the sheriff after the second visit yielded no results. It was always the same. No footprints, no sign of forced entry, no explanation. On the fourth night, I decided to stay up and wait, determined to catch whoever was tormenting me. I turned off all the lights and sat in the dark living room, clutching a flashlight and a heavy wrench I'd taken from the toolbox. The rain had stopped, but the wind was still howling outside, rattling the windows. At exactly 10:03 p.m., the knocking started. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it quickly grew louder and more insistent. My hands trembled as I approached the front door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but the darkened porch. Then the knock came again, this time from the back door. I spun around, my pulse racing. Moving cautiously, I crept toward the kitchen. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, as if whoever was out there wanted to make sure I knew they were there. But when I reached the back door and flipped on the porch light, the knocking stopped. I stared out into the darkness, my reflection in the glass trembling as much as I was. Then, faintly, I saw it, a shape in the woods. It was tall and motionless, barely visible between the trees. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was staring directly at me. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight, The knocking resumed, this time coming from multiple spots at once. The front door, the windows, even the walls. It was deafening, surrounding me, closing in. Panicking, I ran upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom. The knocking followed, growing louder and more frenzied. The walls shook, the sound reverberating through the house like a heartbeat. I grabbed my phone and dialed the sheriff's office again, but the call wouldn't connect. The screen flickered, the battery draining rapidly until it shut off completely. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I sat in silence, my heart hammering in my chest. The house was eerily still, the only sound the faint rustle of leaves outside. Gathering my courage, I crept to the window and peered out. The shape was gone. I left Thornhill Road the next morning, packing what little I could into my car and driving until the town was far behind me. I didn't look back, and I've never returned. The house is still there, though. I saw a listing for it recently, a rental ad that mentioned its charming vintage features and secluded location. There was no mention of the knocks, the footprints, or the shadow in the woods. Sometimes, late at night, I think about the house and wonder if it still remembers me, and if, somewhere in the darkness, it's waiting for someone else to answer the door.